Today we'll again be speaking about age and gender as determinants of leisure in the second part of this unit. Just a little bit of a recap. Last time we spoke about Erikson's adult life stages. These are the 8 life stages, and we will be going through all of these. Reminder that you don't need to memorize like all of these specific names or anything. Just generally understand, kind of recognize the for multiple choice these different stages of life. We began by talking about childhood in leisure. Specifically, we spoke about play. Important to understand the definition here of play. Specifically, things to understand is that we looked at that from birth to age 1 is when children have practice play. And specifically, they're looking at object permanence. So understanding that things exist even when they're out of sight, like peekaboo and knocking things off a chair, high chair. And then at ages 1 to 2, they begin to do symbolic and pretend play based on, imagination and, pretending. Around age 3 to 5, um, they children first have parallel play when they're just not actually interacting with each other, but it's side by side play. And somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5, they gradually move to more associative play that is cooperative in their symbolic and practice. And that finally then leads to age 6, which is cooperative play. And that's, as I emphasized, that's really when children have the cognitive ability to really understand rules and can, cooperate and do things collectively as a group. We're now going to speak about some of the early developmental tasks and leisure experiences in these early stages of childhood. So, Erikson called stage 1 basic trust versus mistrust, meaning that obviously a child is totally dependent on others. And really, what they're looking at is, if they're looking to have their needs met as a baby, that their caregiver is meeting their needs. And when needs are met, then this is how children develop trust with that adult. And Erikson viewed, if needs are not met in childhood, that's when children can develop mistrust. So the focus then is obviously that your needs are going to be satisfied. And it's really then about experiencing a sense of security. So, how do infants relax, or how are they feeling comfortable? But when babies feel confident that their caregiver will care for them in a predictable and continuous way, when it's reliable, that really allows emotional security for those kids. And Erikson viewed that when you have that security, it then allows the baby to explore and move into play. And I guess that kind of follows like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that the baby's basic needs are met, therefore they can do more kind of higher level exploration of their environment. And this is like, for example, there when I had babies, like I could tell my grandparents thought that I kind of spoiled them all the time, and always, every time they cried, I'd be right there. Um, but that's not how my grandparents were told how to raise children. It was more, they thought that they viewed it as spoiling if you were always that attentive. But we know that from psychology that when a baby's needs are constantly met like that, it eventually allows them to be independent later on in life. So the more secure that they feel in infancy, then they're going to have more confidence to do things on their own as they mature. Between the ages of 1 to 3, Erickson called this autonomy versus shame and doubt. But this is when children are establishing autonomy. Autonomy meaning independence, ability to make decisions, perceived freedom. So, this is when children start to exercise some degree of choice. They are trying to establish control and their initial experiences of freedom. And Erickson viewed that, this is a very important developmental milestone, and that if children aren't allowed to establish this sense of autonomy at this age, that it could affect their autonomy and perceived freedom in later life. So, when Erickson believed then that if a child doesn't have some ability to show independence, that they will start to have feelings of self-doubt. It can, influence their self-esteem and thus reduce their ability or willingness to explore and experiment with the world around them. So, at this stage of life, initial experiences of freedom are actually, you can see them with children. It's when there's maybe the very initial bits of being independent from parents, and that might even just be doing something in a different room. But this is when children's favorite word is no. And now, partly that's because it's a very easy word to say, and it's one of the ones that they can actually say themselves, and also probably their parents hear. But it's, um, children at that age, uh, they call it the terrible twos, but it's often because it's just constantly no, 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 mummy, no, mummy. But it's because they're attempting to establish their own independence. When children move to ages 3 and 5, um, Erickson called this initiative versus guilt. So, this is when children will often start to show or exercise a sense of initiative, meaning they themselves are starting something. They might be trying new activities. They might express the desire to take initiative in activities. I can, for example, at this age, I can remember, my sons beginning to express, leisure activities that they wanted. That they um, wanted to be able to learn to swim. They wanted to learn to fish. They, uh, you know, maybe riding a bike or certain sports or whatever it is. Uh, Beginning to not just do the activities that their parents are providing, but they begin to start to socialize with the outside world, so they have their own ideas that they're bringing back. And this is when future behaviors are established, really, like being able to take risk, like hopefully just minimal risk. But also, this is when you can learn to be a source of your own entertainment. So, not always having to have someone doing something for you, but, children start to really be able to play on their own at this stage, and have their own sort of pretend world and games. Erickson believed, though, that parents or caregivers can stifle these initiatives, that sometimes parents might punish children for initiative, um, and that can develop feelings of guilt that will affect, self-directed activity throughout their life. And, I'm going to give a little example, but I can remember the first time at, between the ages of like 3 and 5, and, my son does the first time where he gets his own snack. And, of course, he's makes, a couple things fall out of the fridge. He spills the milk all over the place. There's a bit of a mess. He's got crackers everywhere and all that. And there's two choices then as a parent. If I had gotten angry with him for not getting permission from me to go into the fridge or the kitchen, if I had punished him for that initiative, that might make it so he feels then that he can't be independent, maybe that he shouldn't try to get his own snack ever again. In contrast, the other way I could have approached that would be to say, oh, that was great work on getting your own snack. Um, Next time, you can always ask mommy for some help or whatever, etc. So, and now, for example, it might be a silly example, but even today now, instead of being angry about the mess, I've now set up the environment so my children can get their own snacks, by making sure that the things that they might want are just on this one shelf. I have, bowls that they can reach themselves, etc. Allowing them to be self-directed. So this is really when children really develop a sense of purpose. And, for example, kids really like having little chores at this stage or choosing the activities that the family is doing. During ages 6 to 11, Erikson called this industriousness versus inferiority. So, this is really when children develop the cognitive abilities to enable them to complete a task, like schoolwork, play. I've explained this already. It's when they, for example, can cognitively understand rules, for example. So, children at this stage then are really establishing competence to produce industry, meaning that they're starting to get skills that they will likely use for the rest of their life. And often these skills we achieve through recreation and leisure activities. So, for example, they start to see achieving a sense that they have things that others value, and this might be that, they're one of the best kickers on the soccer team, or that they are able to paint a picture that everyone thought was beautiful, or they are able to sing a song that people enjoyed, or tell a story, create something. It's when group learning really happens. So you're starting to develop skills, but also compare to others. So at this age, my children are at this stage, and it's when I can see they're starting to say, "Oh, look, um, that person is better at this than me, but I'm better at this." So you're kind of comparing, but also learning then in groups who has the best skills for which task. And this is also when expressive and creative abilities are taken very seriously. So, expressing who you are, whether that's through a sport or recreation, or even, art and reading and literature and storytelling. So Erickson believed that if we don't support children's efforts at this stage to be industrious, that they will develop feelings of inferiority and inadequacy because they start to think that perhaps they don't have skills and abilities that others value. So here, it's really about trying to develop competence in children by making sure that they have the skills to do certain things. And again, this is why things like physical literacy and like fundamental movement skills are important. We are establishing basic skills at this stage too, in order for lifelong pursuits of, let's say, of sport or physical activity. And so if people don't establish those, that's when they can feel inferior. I gave the example another lecture about girls. How research has shown that girls were very much dropping out of sport, especially when they, wasn't required as part of physical education. And a lot of that was because they had not been taught basic physical literacy. So they didn't have the skills, therefore, it made them feel inferior and inadequate. Again, this is why it's so important to make sure people have competence. And this, of course, also involves then all the things we've previously discussed, like matching of skills and challenge, having equal groups, small steps, etc. We'll now move into adolescence and leisure. So this is a leisure and the developmental tasks of adolescence. So we'll first talk about the developmental milestones of adolescence, and then we'll speak about the role of leisure during this stage of life. So Erickson called this stage 5, ages 12 to 18. So this is, teenagehood, identity versus role confusion. So this is when people really form ego identity, which is really your self-image. It's, when we're really struggling as humans to figure out kind of who we are. It's about having a strong sense of identity. And when you do have a strong sense of identity, it's much easier then to transition into adulthood with confidence. In contrast, Erickson said, if adolescents don't develop a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of self, that they kind of have confusion of what he called ego identity. So when Erickson is saying too that the strength then of adolescence is fidelity. So this means that it's really about figuring out who you are, your view of yourself, also developing relationships at this stage. So developing sincerity, a sense of duty in relationships with others. And the other important things are that in adolescence, adolescents are active producers of their own development. And what that means is that it's in adolescence that for the first time you're often fully like choosing your own leisure activities. Now, obviously, your parents might still be involved in this somewhat, but it's starting to be much more self-directed. It's also during this time that you're learning skills in recreation and leisure that you will use for the rest of your life in your development. So for example, through, if you're part of like your team, a team sport in high school, you begin to learn things like time management, having to set an alarm, let's say, to get up for practice, being organized. These are skills that you will use throughout your whole life. In your volunteer activities, you learn, for example, the first time I ever did public speaking would have been, in my recreation and leisure, whether it was like a play or being a part of a club and having to speak to a group or something. Obviously, these are skills that I can still continue to use today. Also, adolescents at this stage are very preoccupied with themselves and who they are. And this isn't a bad thing. People say adolescents have they're kind of uh, into themselves, but that is their stage of development. They are preoccupied with themselves because they are trying to learn who they are and only start to begin to view like where do they fit in their social world. It is only really at this stage around the age of 12 that people really start to develop abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning is when you can understand concepts that you can't see. Okay. So, for example, like hypothetical ideas like beauty, truth, love. These are all things that you really start to explore during adolescence. And it also then is about your ability to have optimal experiences. And I can think, at this stage, I can remember myself, this is when I was, journaling all the time and, dear diary, listening to, songs that now I listen to and I think, they're so sad or melancholy. But it's because that in adolescence, we're really kind of exploring these things. Like, what do these things mean? And what do they also mean to us? In adolescence, it's also usually um, can happen earlier, but gender differences really start to begin. It's mostly due to socialization. So, whether that's through life and leisure. So, I think things are changing now, but for example, when at that stage, that's for example often when maybe girls begin, as I said, to not continue sports, and again that could be socialized though, that they are being told by society or whatever to not. Another thing that's important to understand with adolescence is that the intensity of the experience is important. So, adolescents have a higher level of optimal or of arousal than other stages of life. This is when you want loud music, bright lights, high stimulation. This is why, you know, adolescents experiment with, let's say, drugs and alcohol. It's about the um, experience, like the sensations of it, the stimulation. So, uh, when I think like I used to love going to music concerts. When I went to a lot of music concerts when I was in high school and early, um, in university, and um, I know that now in my 40s, when I can't, I find it like so loud and I can't handle it, but that's because I don't have the same desire or need for my experience to be that intense. But this is also why you can think about this for recreation. It means that the more stimulation that you provide to adolescents, maybe the better. Maybe they enjoy having the loud music and bright lights and all that. Um, when also in adolescence, because they're trying to figure out their ego, their identity, it's when you have deviation amplifying, meaning that you start to do things that are norms for your peers, but avoid things that are norms for others. And what that means is you might start to do, dress a certain way or choose certain activities because your peers are doing it, not because your siblings or your parents are doing those things. So uh, you might try things that are like totally the opposite of what you're accustomed to, just because that's what you want. And we know that in adolescence, friends and peers are the most important social influencer. It's approval from peers. I mean, it can be so strong, obviously, that you can have, peer pressure and that sort of thing, and you can have negative behaviors. So, in adolescence, it's important that people establish a sense of identity, and this comes through identification and individuation. Identification is identifying with others, feeling a sense of belonging. So, this is, of course, very important in adolescence to feel that you belong. And that is, it could be perhaps the most important need that adolescents have. And it's so strong, as I said, that they can sometimes maybe get into situations or be doing activities that aren't healthy because of their need to feel a sense of belonging. But even though they're trying to identify with others, At the same time, they're trying to be their own self, to be an individual. So the process of adolescents defining themselves as unique and, different from others. And, we often do this, how we dress, or how, you know, uh, I don't know, things that people can see about us. Or maybe you do an activity that is totally different from anyone else, that kind of sets you apart, and that can make you feel unique and provide self identity. So, with individuation, obviously the role of leisure is that um, leisure is very important to this process, meaning like to make yourself feel like you're an individual. So people make a symbolic statement often about who they are through their recreation and leisure. And, for example, when I think of my high school, now I realize that my high school experience might have been different than people growing up, let's say in Newfoundland, that where the classes might have been smaller. My high school is probably 2,000 adolescents. And Uh, but you knew it was in our recreation and leisure is how we defined our groups. You had we called them, we didn't say jocks, but I shouldn't, and I don't like that term, but I mean, the people who were the athletes. Then you had the drama group, and then the music group, and then you had the people who are very highly involved in the different clubs or environment. And anyway, all of this was leisure activities for how we then identified ourselves and which group we kind of belonged with. And it's also then at this time, adolescents are making leisure choices then to be producers of their own life. And that might be more important than the quality of the experience to them. It's about, getting skills and experiences to figure out their path. And now that can be, obviously your music, your dress, the style, including your activities. Another thing that's very important in adolescence is this is when serious and invested leisure emerges. So remember that serious leisure is like career like. It's almost like a job. And invested leisure is when, it's really you're putting a lot of time, effort, and resources and skills into something. So uh, this is when you kind of, a lot of people start specializing in activities. You might become very serious, let's say, with music. Let's say doing all your Royal Conservatory music exams. Start having a band, playing in an orchestra, or whatever it is. You might be doing high level, more like athletic training, maybe with even the view that you want to be on a varsity team when you're in high school or when you're in university. So it's becomes serious, and it helps with self development. And as I've already mentioned, it's in these kind of serious and invested activities that we learn work like skills. We learn cooperation, we learn time management, conflict resolution, like how, what if you don't agree with someone? We learn how to motivate ourselves, how to motivate others, how to get tasks completed. You know, often, for example, like the first time I ever did planned a recreation program for a group was in high school. Or like my first teaching experiences were in high school, when I think, but this when I was an assistant coach. So in these activities then, it's not just about that these activities are important to identity and who an adolescent is, but it's also about gaining skills and having experiences that people will carry forth throughout their lives. We do know, though, that also during adolescence, there can be a large drop off in sports. and activities, especially among girls. But many childhood activities might be abandoned during adolescence. And that's often maybe due to specialization. For example, um, you, I don't know, let's say when you're a kid, you have swimming lessons, music lessons, and you're on two sports or something like that. Well, maybe when you get to adolescence with, going to school, maybe you even get a little part-time job, and then you're also have your leisure activities, you might be reducing some of them because you don't have the time to do all of them or the resources. And it also could be because you're specializing. So I know a lot of people always tell me, like, at the stage of life, they kind of chose which sport they were going to focus on, and they found it really hard to do that. But they maybe didn't have the time or resource, money to like continue all of these things. They needed to pick one. I remember at this time my niece, she was, at around age 12, she was a wonderful dancer and she was also a wonderful violinist. But in order to be good at where she wanted to be with one or the other, she needed to devote her time just to one of them and also had only resources for one. And it was very hard on her. She loved music, but in the end, she chose that it was dance that she really wanted to focus on because that's what she really loved. So, she dropped the music more, and just had it more as a leisure, something to do in her free time, not really as a focused activity. Obviously, socialization and interaction is very important at this stage. In order to get teens to engage in these activities, social activities are very enjoyed, and it's really important no matter what program that you are providing for adolescents, whether it's sports or health or art or dance or anything, that there's a social component to it and that they feel sense of belonging. And it's important that you facilitate that you allow the student, probably not students, adolescents to interact with each other. Another thing that's very important at this time is relaxation and periods of solitude are very important. Unfortunately, our society has developed so we often have adolescents who go from school to this activity to a job, and some of them have no free time. But because your cognition is really developing at this time, because you're being able to think of abstract thought and being rational, it's very important at this time to think and just daydream. I can remember spending lots of time just like listening to music, thinking, writing in my diary at this time. And those are important to development. So we have to remember that not all things that are good for an adolescent have to be like the do. That socialization is very important as well. And also just periods for reflection. Next, we're going to move then into adulthood and leisure. So we're going to look at the developmental tasks of adulthood and how it relates to leisure, looking at emerging and early adulthood, middle age, and then later life. So Erickson called stage 6 to include people who are 19 to 40, which is quite a very large span. And I think actually, a lot of people would view, we would kind of call 19 to 30 to be like an emerging adulthood or young adult. And then, 30 to 40 is kind of different. But Erickson kind of lumped it all together. This was also different times. When I know in today's society, for example, yourselves, a lot of the term is called emerging adult, where you actually don't identify yourself as an adult until late 20s or 30s. Where, for example, like in my generation, I think, I don't know, as soon as you were 25 at least, or earlier than that, kind of viewed yourself as an adult. So society also changes how these things work. But generally, though, during young adulthood, um, it's when people are really undertaking productive work and establishing intimate relationships. That's really the focus of this stage. People are starting to have serious relationships, marriage, having children. People are, and Erickson was saying that if the inability to establish these intimate relationships will then lead to social isolation, obviously. So it's important that we, at this stage, we're developing the ability to give and receive love, to make long-term commitments in relationships. So the focus then, Erickson called it love, that it's about mutual devotion in some sort of a shared identity, the fusing of oneself within another person. And again, this is probably very socially constructed. People now are often not getting married as early anymore, or might not even have, serious relationships until even later 20s. So we know that at this stage, various rules of leisure then are that during this stage, uh, between 19 and 29, people spend more leisure time alone than the other age groups, except for the elderly. And that's simply maybe due to that you're not, um, if you're not married, for example, or having a family, you'll be more likely to do some things by yourself. Obviously, at this stage, you're spending a lot more time in productive activities like school and work. And it is, obviously the focus is on establishing relationships as well as establishing your career. It is also at this time that people often have more intense experiences that involve risk, especially in between the ages of 19 and 30. So, for example, concussions uh, are much more likely to happen during that stage of life. And that is obviously because people are more likely to be doing activities that result in concussion, as well as there could be, like, risk. But this is often, when people are more likely to be susceptible to unhealthy behaviors like unprotected sex or substance abuse and forms of risky behaviors. Obviously, a lot of the focus at this stage is still on social leisure because it's about leisure fosters your interpersonal relationships. And, you have your leisure with your life partners. You often meet people, your life partner, in your leisure, recreation, and leisure activities. And so it's also at this stage you're kind of moving from doing your own leisure to learning how to, you're kind of doing leisure with other people, with someone else. The next life stage is ages 40 to 65. So generativity versus stagnation. Generativity means to be active involvement in teaching, guiding the next generation. So it's about being productive and contributing to society. So wanting to share the knowledge and skills that you have with others. And Erickson said that if you're not, kind of helping others or passing down information, that stagnation occurs, or if you don't have this kind of outlet, you kind of get self-absorbed. So at this stage, the basic strength is care. So it's about a broad concern for others and the need to teach others. So when you're really developing an interest in guiding the development of the generations below you. I should have mentioned on that slide, pardon me, that this is when you're more likely to do things like coaching and volunteer roles where you're kind of providing skills. This is also, Erickson said that disillusionment occurs at this stage. And this is basically like that you could have like this midlife crisis, but where goals of earlier adulthood are reconsidered or abandoned. But I don't know if it's so much about a midlife crisis, but it's also this is when you have really developed such a strong sense of identity that you also are okay with saying no to things. So you have a growing unwillingness to keep up appearances and associate with people merely out of a sense of obligation and responsibility. So you don't care as much about what others think is basically what it comes down to. This is, I guess I'm at the beginning of this stage of life. And I would say that, I've noticed I have abandoned, for example, some volunteer things. And that's a lot because I'm thinking, I'm not getting enjoyment out of it anymore. So I just feel like, I don't have to keep doing it. And I feel only fine, like okay now that I can say no to that. It's more about doing things because I want to. And or I can see the benefit of it. But it's also about reevaluating, you're thinking, you kind of start reflecting on, what did you think you were going to do in life? And here you are, 44, and, did you do okay? Or are there, and also thinking about, if there are goals that you have in life, well, you feel kind of like you should get started on them now. So there's also kind of a loss of structure, relinquishing of commitments, and role loss. And that can create confusion. Like there's a lot of things that happen during this stage. For example, at this stage of life might be when your children are starting to leave the house, or you are retiring and you no longer have these specific roles that you always had in life. So what is the role and impact of leisure then? Well, there's a lot of variation and complexity of work and family life. At this stage of life, it's really focusing on family leisure often. So there's really a loss of increased free time. It really depends on your work and your children. But, I really find, for example, at right now, I'm not I don't do that many activities, I'm going to be honest, that are like really just for myself. A lot of it is, you know, um, I love gardening, but we do that as a family too, or going for a hike, etc. So I find like really only my crochet or that kind of thing, arts and crafts that I do, is really the only time that is specifically my leisure time. But there's also, you can at this stage, you might have greater financial security. So that would mean greater discretionary income. Again, it really depends though. Like, for example, myself, um, I'm not that way, but that's because I had children kind of later in life. So my kids are not yet, independent at all. Whereas someone else might find, their children have, maybe are out of university and all of a sudden they do have more financial income. This is often when the first signs of aging happen. So health problems may start to develop. Um, I myself, I agree with this. Like all of a sudden you're after 40, things just you just start to see that, oh, maybe I should get my eyes checked because I might need glasses. Or you start to notice, let's say you've the beginnings of arthritis or that sort of thing. There's also usually a focus on serious and invested leisure activities again at this stage. So things that maybe are volunteer activities. And you're not as focused on personal and immediate gratification types of leisure. It's more like having a career in a leisure, continuing to learn and maybe master a specific sport or leisure activity. And lastly is the last stage is 65 plus. So ego integrity versus despair. I just want to mention here that currently we would say, you know, lumping older adults 65 to, let's say, 105 is, 40 years there. We tend to lump older adults all together, but we have to always remember that functional age is more important than chronological age, meaning that you could have someone who's 65 whose physical functioning is the equivalent of a very healthy 85-year-old. They could probably do the same activities. It's not about how old you are. It's, about it's really more than about your health resources and cognitive. But this is often when you're evaluating your entire life, looking back with satisfaction. And obviously, the strength of this age of older adults is wisdom. So they really have this kind of detached concern with the whole of life. Like it's a kind of, um, they're wise and have experiences. So this is really like developing a sense of acceptance of life as it was lived and the importance of the people and the relationships that individual developed over their lifespan. Recreation and leisure at this stage can be very varied, and I'm not going to get too much into all the specifics because we could, you can have a whole course on older adults. But we have to know that at this stage, developing new leisure activities might happen due to retirement or reestablishing them. A lot of people, you know, if especially if you had a family and you worked and maybe you never had a lot of leisure, all of a sudden being retired can be very hard for people, especially if they didn't really have kind of recreation and leisure a lot in their life. So sometimes people are learning new things at this time. Hobbies and expressive activities are very important. And reminiscence as an activity itself, life review. This is I remember my neighbor starting to write a book about her life in her 90s. She had she had just she was someone who had, gone probably one of the more educated women in Newfoundland of her kind of generation. It was interesting life that she had lived. My grandfather is constantly writing down stories of his life, and particularly about the World War, getting them down right now at 99, because he wants to make sure that his great grandchildren understand, what happened during World War II, and also even before that, the Depression. So that's a leisure activity. We have things like this is why scrapbooking and kind of recollection and storytelling are often used as therapeutic modalities in, for example, seniors' home and long term care settings. But we have to know that at this stage, people can still experience leisure despite physical, social, cognitive constraints, and it's important for us, to develop these. So, for examination, it's important for you to really understand the influences and role of leisure at each of these stages. And, for example, here I could have, I might say that um, reminiscence is most important in what, as a leisure activity, at what stage of life, and provide them. And then you would know, oh, it's got to be the older adult one. It's 65 plus. Or, as I said, I'd also put stage 8 or ego integrity, whatever. All the words will be there so that whichever way you've kind of understood and learned them. The other thing I want to mention is for your term paper. Some people organize, if you look at the student examples, some people might organize their term paper by these stages. So, for example, first for their past leisure, start with stage 1 and stage 2, and then adolescence, and then you're ending with the last one, or not the last one, looking at 19 to 40s, where most of you likely are for your present leisure activities. We're now going to speak a little bit about gender as sources for leisure differences. We could go, I mean, this also could be a whole course itself, looking at gender and leisure. But gender differences do account for a lot of variance in leisure behavior. Again, what I would say, is it biological or social? Well, I would say most of this is socially constructed through social interaction and socialization influences. You're one of the first generations growing up where, gender is viewed differently. It is viewed more not as a binary concept, as male, female, but as, being a fluid thing, as a continuum, and even something that you can be on different parts of it throughout your life. But when you're working with others, who are not of your generation, you really need to understand how gender has influenced their leisure activities. Now, whether biological or socially constructed, we don't know, but we do know that females tend to place greater emphasis on relationships, and thus less are drawn to activities with conflict. So, this can be, leisure activities. Women are generally not as into things where there'd be, a lot of combat or conflict. Then not to say they don't want competition, but just not things that aren't really about kind of like a team or still nurturing of others. Some research says that females perceive self-maintenance and extracurricular activities more leisure-like than males. So, meaning that females may find things like going shopping or as a leisure activity. And again, I'm not so sure. I think that's probably like kind of a stereotype, even in saying that. But for example, like I'm a female and I can't stand shopping. But there's research to suggest these differences. Again, traditionally, males have been more involved in sports compared to females. I think certainly this is definitely changing, especially in your generation. But when you're working with others, you need to understand that. My mother, in her early 70s, there, she hardly even received really physical education class. There was no sport. She learned no physical skills. So while she does do, some things like curling and golf and tennis, these were things that she learned as an adult, not, when she was in adolescence. Finally, women's leisure in adulthood might be more likely to be integrated with family roles, like, um, but I think this has definitely changed because, for example, I know tons of men, fathers, who their leisure really gets focused on their children in terms of their role as a coach, for example. But women do tend to, maybe you start volunteering to do things at your children's school or, helping your child's sports team or that kind of thing. So again, I'd personally not, maybe it tends to be that women are more likely to do this, but I think that is changing in our society. There is research, though, to suggest that females are more likely to attribute failure in an activity to their own ability, to think that it's their fault. In contrast, males will attribute loss to bad luck or maybe that they didn't try hard. So, for example, this is why when working with females, it's very important that they receive the sense of competence and that they do not feel that their internal locus control is about themselves, about their failure, but to look at, elsewhere. Obviously, men might place more emphasis on winning or being more competitive, where females often place more importance on relationships in leisure. So, I look at, for example, both my parents are golfers, and if I asked my dad how his group of guys was after a game of golf, my dad will, tell me, well, who got the best score and etc., who did what and all this on the shots, different holes. But my mother, she hardly even talks about the golf. She would say, well, so and so has to have an operation, or so and so just had a grandchild. It's about the relationships that she's having during that leisure activity. And to some extent, women experience greater freedom of choice in leisure settings that are outside the home. I've mentioned this before, that I think this is gendered based on social roles. So, for example, if the female, whoever is more likely to do the caregiving of the child or the housework, they're the ones who probably feel more leisure outside of the home. But so again, I think that is changing, but it still is something that, most commonly, especially in like people generations like 60 plus, I think that is certainly true. And my generation is kind of the first generation where that I am the primary financial person instead of my husband, but that's only starting in our society. Another thing is that research has found that males and females differ in how they use leisure to cope with stress. That males are more likely to use active physical activity after being stressed. So, you have a stressful day or life event, and therefore you, go for a run or go shoot some hoops with the guys. And whereas females might be more likely to exercise to prevent stress, like to do things in order not to get stressed in the first place. Now, as I've mentioned already, that I think a lot of these gender differences, there's reasons for them. Is it biological or is it social? Well, it can be that a lot of this has to do with discrimination, prejudice, and limited opportunities. For example, women may experience greater constraints, but maybe that's just because of the social rules that they have that limit their time and freedom in leisure. And so so I'm really about being a woman, but maybe it's about being the mother. And women also are objectified for the leisure of men, often. And this is in our society. Prostitution, pornography. Think of, I'm not saying like cheerleading is not a sport, but when you look on TV and, obviously it's sexualized. And again, that's about then for the leisure of men. I think a lot of things are socialized in children's play. Right away, we gender from the very beginning. Everything's about pink and blue. You know, I find it a bit interesting that during this time when we um, are kind of understanding gender differently in our society, yet we're having gender revealing parties where, you cut the cake to see if you're having a boy or a girl. And then everything's about being pink or blue or etc. And we actually assume a biological basis for toys and play preferences, and that's incorrect. So, uh, and this is all influenced by peers, siblings, media, and culture. So, for example, I've tried to raise my children, my boys, but to have like non-gendered things. Um, my son loves cleaning. Not sure why, but he just really likes it. And so I remember when he was younger, I was trying to find a child's broom for him. I went to Toys R Us. I'm all over the place looking. So finally asked, because I couldn't find it in any area. Well, it was in this section that was clearly the girls section. And of course, the broom was bright pink and all this. And I'm thinking, that's gendered. So what? A boy's never going to use a broom in his life? Or another example is like my sister gave my son a baby doll, a baby boy doll when I was having my second child. And I guess the point was so he could dress it and stuff while I was changing the baby. And I wanted to I was looking for a stroller. And of course all the strollers were pink and had flowers. Now I don't know about you, but I bet you my husband used the stroller more than I did, pushing the stroller. Today's society is different. Why is the stroller in the girls section of the toys? Fathers also use strollers. Same with tools. Why are the tools only in the boys section? Are girls not allowed to be learning how to use a hammer? Or that can't be a profession for them? So right away, we have socialized children from just where we put stuff in the store, what we purchase. I remember, and you feel socially, judged. I remember that some of the neighbors, I could tell they really wondered about me with giving my son this doll and his pink stroller at first. But of course, he didn't quite play the same with it. He wasn't really nurturing it like maybe a little girl would. But he still played with it, but he also mostly he'd bring Jimmy up to the top of the hill and woo, Jimmy'd go flying, down the slide or that kind of thing. And there could be biological differences as well. We're not really sure, but in my opinion, we need to totally forget about boys and girls, colors and leisure activities. And what is what? They're just activities. The differences could also be due to gender identity. So there's some view that people are born biologically as male or female, but we learn to be masculine or feminine through socialization, um, and sometimes, unfortunately, we base socialization though on biology. So, for example, a study, now this was done in the 80s, but Hirschman in 1984 measured motivational dispositions and demonstrated that these dispositions differed among individuals, but were also related to gender identity. So we're all born with a specific biological sex, male or female, but socialization, we learn to become masculine or feminine or gender identity. And you can be high or low on both masculine and feminine gender identity. And this can, my opinion is this can also change in your lifetime. But she's found that people could be classified into 4 groups depending on how high or low they were on these identities. So androgynous means that you're high on both, high feminine, high masculine. And for example, I personally think that I'm more this. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. Right now, today. Or undifferentiated means kind of could be low on both. Or feminine orientation means high on femininity but low on masculinity. And finally, a masculine orientation is obviously high on masculine but low on feminine. But I think I would class myself as androgynous, high on both of these spectrums. And Hirschman found that sex, like if you're biologically male or female, was not as good as a predictor of leisure as gender identity. And for example, there was differences then in these things. For example, she found people who had a masculine identity were very motivated to seek leisure activities that are competitive. Again, it's not about being male, the plumbing of it, the being the sex, but the biology, but about just being high on a masculine type of identity. Where, in contrast, androgynous was like motivated by needs for fun, pleasure, escape, adventure, and flow, and also needed more a variety of these types of leisure activities. So a good multiple choice question would be for you to slightly understand, the results of this study, and perhaps, understand that we have the feminine, masculine, androgynous, and undifferentiated, and that it's really our gender identity that influences leisure more than, let's say, biological sex. So, for a review, make sure that you understand and can identify the types of influences on development: that normative, age-graded influence, normative, history-graded, and non-normative life events. So I might give you a multiple choice question in which I'd provide a scenario, and you would have to tell me which of those events it was. Make sure that you can understand, identify, or discuss like changes in leisure behavior over the lifespan. For example, we talked about changes in leisure participation. For example, overall leisure tends to decrease as we age. We looked at leisure repertoire, for example, that it peaks during middle adulthood. I might ask you things, how does interest in change itself as one ages? We learned that, you have changes in experimentation or novelty versus stability. What are differences and patterns about continuity and change in leisure behavior? So, for example, make sure you understand the difference in being, a replacer, quitter, adder, and continuer. Make sure you understand the limitations and criticisms of the lifespan models. We talked about how they were endocentric and focused on, basically they're very developed and focused by affluent white Western males. So obviously we're not really sure how generalizable they are to other countries or the rest of society. Make sure you understand the role of play. We talked about all those different types of play. You need to know which type of play goes with which age group. As I said, you don't need to be able to identify all these developmental stages or anything, but generally understand patterns of development and leisure through childhood and during adolescence. Make sure, what is for each of those stages, understand what is the role and impact of leisure in adolescence. And again, understanding all of that when it comes to early, mid, and later adulthood. What's the role and impact of leisure at those different stages? And lastly is looking at gender as a source of leisure difference. Be able to identify some gender differences that we might see in leisure. but also be able to identify why these gender differences likely occur. That it's probably more due to discrimination and prejudice, and also gender-related differences in play, and finally, gender identity. There were several terms in this unit. Obviously, play, all the different types of play, development was another term that is important for you to understand. And that will conclude then the unit on age and gender as determinants of leisure. Again, I remember that you can kind of see how all of this might be useful information for you to start thinking about how this applies to your past and present leisure for also your term paper. And that will conclude this unit. Take care.